The Zarnok were a species whose reputation had been etched into the galactic consciousness over millennia. Towering, muscular beings with an exoskeleton-like structure that could deflect most known energy weapons, they were regarded as the undisputed champions of physical prowess. Entire wars had ended merely at the suggestion of their involvement. No species in the galaxy dared challenge them. Not until humanity came along, humans had only been part of the interstellar community for a few decades. In that short time, they had disrupted countless norms. Their technology was unconventional, their biology adaptable to extremes, and their persistence seemingly limitless. What the Zarnok found most infuriating, however, was the humans' lack of deference. Where other species cowered in submission, humans displayed an unsettling defiance. They were clever, resourceful, and, worst of all, unpredictable. It began with a routine dispute over mining rights on a distant moon in the Zarnok-controlled sector. Humanity, through its representative in the Galactic Council, petitioned for equal access to the moon's resources. The Zarnok delegation, led by the imposing General Varthak, scoffed at the request. Varthak, a hulking figure with amber eyes that glowed faintly under the council's lights, spoke with a voice that resonated like thunder. "Humans are bold to speak of equality in matters of strength," he sneered, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "Your kind is weak. You do not belong here." The human representative, Ambassador Grace Evans, a poised woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, stood her ground. She acknowledged the Zarnok's physical superiority, but argued that strength alone should not dictate the future of the galaxy. Her words were calculated, meant to provoke without outright insulting, but Varthak was not one to tolerate challenges, perceived or otherwise. "You claim strength is not paramount," Varthak said, his voice rising. "Prove it." The chamber grew silent. The other council members, beings of various shapes and sizes, exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone understood what Varthak's words implied. A challenge had been issued, a formal contest of supremacy. Such contests were rare, reserved for settling disputes between species when diplomacy failed. The terms were simple: a series of trials, each testing a different aspect of a species' capabilities. Victory would mean the recognition of superiority. Defeat would carry immense humiliation. Ambassador Evans hesitated, weighing the risks. Humanity's pride was at stake, but so was its future. Reluctantly, she agreed. "We accept your challenge," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of doubt in her mind. "But let it be known that humanity fights not for dominance, but for the right to coexist." Varthak's laugh echoed through the chamber. "Then prepare to learn the cost of defiance." The Galactic Council selected a neutral arbiter to oversee the trials. The location would be the uninhabited moon of Kalos, a barren rock with conditions harsh enough to test the mettle of any species. Each side was given 3 weeks to prepare. Humanity scrambled to assemble a team capable of representing the species. Soldiers, scientists, engineers, and strategists were vetted and subjected to grueling tests. Among those selected was Captain Eliza Harper, a decorated officer known for her unorthodox tactics and indomitable spirit. Eliza was a striking figure, with piercing green eyes that seemed to see through walls and a scar running across her cheek, a souvenir from a mission gone wrong. She was not the strongest or fastest, but her mind was a weapon unto itself. When the team met for the first time, she quickly established herself as a natural leader. She spoke with conviction, inspiring confidence even in those who doubted their chances. "We're not here to prove we're the strongest," she told her team. "We're here to prove that strength comes in many forms. The Zarnok think we're weak because we don't have their size or their claws. Let's show them what humans are really made of." The Zarnok, meanwhile, prepared in their own way. Varthak personally selected warriors from his elite guard, each one a living embodiment of their species' power. They trained relentlessly, honing their already formidable abilities. To them, the contest was a mere formality. The outcome, they believed, was inevitable. When the day of the first trial arrived, the atmosphere on Kalos was tense. The arena was a natural crater, its jagged edges forming a stark contrast against the pale sky. Spectators from across the galaxy had gathered, watching from observation decks and holographic feeds. The first trial was announced: hand-to-hand combat, one-on-one. The goal was not to kill, but to incapacitate. The Zarnok were visibly amused as they watched the human team take their places. The humans looked small, almost fragile, compared to the hulking Zarnok warriors. Varthak smirked, turning to Eliza, who stood at the front of her team. "Do your people know what they've gotten themselves into?" he taunted. Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "Do you?" The first match was a crushing defeat for humanity. A human soldier, selected for his exceptional physical fitness, was thrown across the arena like a rag doll within seconds. The second match ended just as quickly, with the Zarnok warrior barely breaking a sweat. By the third match, the crowd was restless, and whispers of humanity's impending humiliation spread like wildfire. Eliza watched each fight intently, analyzing every move. She noticed something peculiar. The Zarnok's attacks, while devastating, were predictable. They relied on brute force, repeating patterns that made them vulnerable to counter-strategies. She realized that winning with strength alone was impossible, but perhaps strength wasn't their only path to victory. As the fourth match began, Eliza stepped forward. "I'll fight this one," she announced. Her team protested, but she silenced them with a look. She entered the arena, facing a Zarnok warrior nearly twice her size. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and jeers. The Zarnok laughed openly, their confidence unwavering. The fight began, and Eliza immediately put her observations to use. She dodged the Zarnok's initial attacks with agility, forcing him to overextend. She used his own momentum against him, landing calculated blows to his joints. The battle was far from easy. Every hit she took felt like a freight train. But she refused to back down. The crowd's laughter turned to stunned silence as the fight dragged on. The Zarnok, clearly frustrated, grew reckless, while Eliza remained focused. Finally, she seized an opening, delivering a precise strike that sent the Zarnok warrior crashing to the ground. She stood over him, battered but victorious. The arena erupted into chaos. The Zarnok were furious, while the humans cheered wildly. Varthak's smirk had vanished, replaced by a glare of disbelief. Eliza returned to her team, her every step a statement of defiance. The first trial had ended in favor of the Zarnok, but humanity had shown that it was far from defeated. For the first time, doubt crept into the minds of their adversaries. As the dust settled on the first trial, the humans regrouped in the makeshift base established on Kalos. It was a barren outpost compared to the sprawling fortresses of the Zarnok. Captain Eliza Harper sat at the head of the team's central table, her arm wrapped in a hastily applied bandage. She winced as the medic tightened the gauze, but her mind was elsewhere, already calculating the next move. The humans knew they were underdogs, but Eliza saw something in the Zarnok that gave her a sliver of hope. Their strength was undeniable, but their overconfidence was just as glaring. She leaned over the holographic display projecting the next trial's parameters. It was a test of strategy, a simulated war game that would determine which side could dominate the battlefield. Unlike the physical combat trial, this one played to humanity's strengths. "Listen up," Eliza said, addressing her team. Her voice was firm, her green eyes scanning each face in the room. "We're not here to match them in brute force. That's their game, and we've seen how that ends. This trial is different. It's about strategy, and that's where we excel. We have to think 3 steps ahead for every move they make." Sergeant Marcus Kane, a burly soldier with a reputation for speaking his mind, frowned as he studied the hologram. "Their forces outnumber us 2-to-1 in this scenario," he said, pointing to the projected battlefield. "Even with strategy, those odds aren't exactly in our favor." Eliza met his gaze, unflinching. "They'll underestimate us again," she said. "That's our advantage. They think we're weak because we lost the first trial, but we're going to show them that strength isn't everything." The team spent the night devising their plan. The wargame would take place in a simulated environment generated by Kalos's advanced holographic technology. Both teams would command virtual forces, and the battlefield would be a vast desert with scattered oases and canyons. The objective was to capture and hold a central fortress. Victory required not just brute force, but careful allocation of resources and adaptability to shifting conditions. Eliza worked closely with Lieutenant Sarah Connors, the team's strategist, to map out their approach. Sarah was known for her analytical mind and uncanny ability to anticipate an opponent's moves. She spoke in quick, clipped sentences as she outlined the plan. "We'll split our forces into 3 units," she said, marking the holographic map. "The Zarnok will expect a direct assault, so we'll feint an attack on the central fortress and draw their main forces into the open. Meanwhile, our flanking units will take control of the high ground in these canyons. Once we've established a position there, we'll use artillery to pin them down." "Sounds good on paper," Marcus said, his skepticism evident. "But what happens when they figure out what we're doing?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "They're not as flexible as we are. The Zarnok rely on overwhelming force, not tactics. If we can force them into a predictable pattern, we can outmaneuver them." The team worked through the night, refining the plan and running simulations. Eliza moved between stations, offering encouragement where needed and making adjustments where she saw fit. She felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders, but refused to let it show. This was more than a contest, it was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. By dawn, the team was ready. The wargame began in a sprawling holographic arena that felt indistinguishable from reality. The desert stretched endlessly, the heat shimmering in the air. Eliza commanded the central unit, leading the feint toward the fortress. As expected, the Zarnok forces responded with overwhelming aggression, charging forward with their usual confidence. "Just as we predicted," Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. "They're committing everything to the central front." "Understood," Eliza replied. She issued orders to her unit, orchestrating a retreat that was chaotic enough to appear genuine, but controlled enough to execute the next phase of the plan. Meanwhile, the flanking units moved into position in the canyons. Marcus led one of these units, his gruff demeanor tempered by a surprising knack for quick thinking under pressure. As his team reached the high ground, they set up artillery and began targeting the Zarnok forces below. The first barrage caught the Zarnok completely off guard, scattering their tightly packed formation. Eliza seized the opportunity, rallying her central unit and turning the feint into a coordinated counterattack. The Zarnoki, overwhelmed and outmaneuvered, struggled to adapt. Their commanders, unaccustomed to such unconventional tactics, made critical errors in judgment, splitting their forces in an attempt to counter the human assault. As the battle raged on, Eliza felt a surge of adrenaline. For the first time since the trials began, it seemed the humans had the upper hand. She directed her unit with precision, exploiting every weakness in the Zarnok's defenses. Marcus's artillery fire continued to rain down from the canyons, keeping the enemy pinned and unable to regroup. By the time the Zarnok realized their mistake, it was too late. The humans had secured the high ground and used it to establish a defensive perimeter around the fortress. The Zarnok launched a desperate final assault, but their strength was no match for the humans' strategic positioning. Eliza watched as their forces faltered, the tide of battle turning decisively in humanity's favor. When the simulation ended, the holographic environment dissolved, revealing the stark arena of Kalos. The human team erupted into cheers, their victory hard-earned and well-deserved. Eliza allowed herself a rare smile, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. General Varthak stood on the Zarnok side of the arena, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. He approached Eliza, towering over her, but she met his gaze without flinching. "This is not over," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It never is," Eliza replied, her tone calm but resolute. As the humans celebrated, Eliza's mind was already on the next trial. The Zarnok would not make the same mistake twice, and the road ahead would only grow more challenging. But for now, humanity had proven that it belonged on the galactic stage, not as mere participants, but as contenders. The sun on Kalos hung heavy and oppressive in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the jagged landscape. It was the day of the third trial, and the air was thick with tension. The humans, having scraped through the second trial with their tactical ingenuity, knew the stakes had risen. The Zarnok would not tolerate another loss. Their pride and dominance demanded retaliation, and they had every intention of crushing humanity into submission. Eliza Harper stood at the edge of the human camp, her eyes scanning the rocky terrain ahead. The third trial was a test of survival, and the rules were deceptively simple. Both teams would be left on an uncharted section of Kalos, stripped of advanced technology and supplies, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and basic tools. The goal was to reach an extraction point located hundreds of kilometers away. Along the way, the teams would face the planet's treacherous terrain and its aggressive wildlife, as well as the constant threat of sabotage from their opponents. Eliza adjusted the straps of her survival pack, her jaw tight with determination. The Zarnok had the advantage in sheer physical resilience, but she knew that brute strength wasn't enough to survive on a planet like Kalos. Her team's survival would depend on their ability to adapt, improvise, and outthink the enemy. The Arbiter, a neutral alien species known as the Thalnari, appeared in a shimmering hologram before both teams. Its translucent form flickered as it outlined the rules of the trial. You will begin your journey at sunrise. Each team will be monitored for adherence to the rules. Any attempt to use unauthorized technology will result in immediate disqualification. The first team to reach the extraction point will be declared the winner. With a wave of its clawed hand, the hologram dissolved, leaving the two teams in silence. Eliza turned to her group, her voice low but steady. We stick together. No one moves alone, no matter what. This isn't just about reaching the extraction point. It's about making sure we all get there alive. Marcus Kane, the team's strongest soldier, nodded, his rugged face set in a grim expression. What do we know about the terrain? Lieutenant Sarah Connors pulled out a crude map provided by the Thalnari. The route is mostly mountainous, with a dense jungle section about halfway through. The jungle is likely to be the most dangerous part. The Zarnok will probably push hard through the open terrain to gain an early lead, but they'll slow down in the jungle. That's where we'll have the chance to outmaneuver them. Eliza nodded. Then we prepare for the jungle. Gather anything that can be used as tools or weapons, and keep your eyes open. The Zarnok won't hesitate to take us out if they get the chance. At sunrise, the trial began. The humans and Zarnok started at opposite ends of the designated route, separated by a vast expanse of rocky plains. Eliza led her team with quiet efficiency, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of danger. The early part of the journey was grueling but uneventful. The team moved quickly, using the cover of boulders and ridges to avoid being spotted by the Zarnok. As the hours stretched into days, the terrain grew harsher. The rocky plains gave way to steep, jagged cliffs, and the air became thin and cold. The humans moved in near silence, conserving their energy and communicating through hand signals. Eliza set a relentless pace, her instincts honed by years of military experience. She knew the Zarnok were faster and stronger, but she also knew that their overconfidence could be their downfall. On the third night, the team reached the edge of the jungle. The dense foliage loomed before them, a wall of shadow and sound. Strange calls echoed through the darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Eliza crouched at the edge of the tree line, her hand resting on the hilt of a crude blade she had fashioned from a shard of rock. "This is where it gets dangerous," she whispered. "Stay close, watch each other's backs." The jungle was a nightmare of tangled vines, poisonous plants, and predatory creatures. The team moved cautiously, their progress slow but steady. Eliza's sharp eyes and quick reflexes saved them more than once, spotting hidden threats before they could strike. Marcus proved invaluable as well, using his brute strength to clear obstacles and fend off smaller predators. The Zarnok, however, were not far behind. On the fourth day in the jungle, Eliza spotted movement in the trees behind them. A flash of silver armor and the faint rustle of leaves told her all she needed to know. The Zarnok were tracking them, and they were closing in. "We need to pick up the pace," she said, her voice low but urgent. "They're right behind us." The team pushed forward, their exhaustion mounting with every step. The jungle seemed alive, its shadows shifting and its sounds growing louder, as if mocking their desperation. On the fifth night, as they camped in a small clearing, the Zarnok struck. The attack came without warning. A massive Zarnok warrior burst into the clearing, his amber eyes gleaming with fury. He moved with terrifying speed, his claws slashing through the air. Marcus met him head-on, his blade flashing in the moonlight. The two clashed in a brutal, primal battle, their grunts and roars echoing through the jungle. Eliza sprang into action, rallying the rest of the team. "Flank him," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He's not alone." "Watch the perimeter." Sure enough, two more Zarnok warriors emerged from the shadows, their movements predatory and precise. Eliza and Sarah fought side by side, their blades slicing through the air in a deadly dance. The humans were outnumbered and outmatched in strength, but their teamwork and ingenuity gave them an edge. Using the terrain to their advantage, they lured the Zarnok into traps and struck with surgical precision. The battle was fierce and bloody, but eventually the Zarnok retreated, their pride wounded and their numbers diminished. The humans were battered and exhausted, but they had survived. As they tended to their wounds and prepared to move on, Eliza stood watch at the edge of the clearing, her blade still in hand. "We're not out of this yet," she murmured, her green eyes fixed on the darkness. "But we're not going down without a fight." The jungle seemed to hum with quiet tension as the humans pressed onward, their resolve stronger than ever. The Zarnok had underestimated them once again, and Eliza was determined to make sure they would regret it. The jungle began to thin as Eliza Harper led her team out into a new terrain, one even more treacherous than the dense, hostile greenery they had just survived. The ground beneath their feet turned uneven and jagged, a stark contrast to the tangled roots and damp earth of the jungle. Before them stretched a vast expanse of volcanic rock, cracked and smoldering, with faint traces of heat rising in the air. The extraction point lay just beyond this wasteland, but the terrain was not their only concern. Somewhere out there, the remaining Zarnok warriors were waiting. Eliza wiped the sweat from her brow and adjusted the strap of her pack, her green eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the tension in her team, the exhaustion etched into their faces. Marcus Kane's jaw was clenched as he hauled a makeshift spear over his shoulder, his movements slow but deliberate. Sarah Connors walked a few paces ahead, her sharp gaze fixed on the map clutched in her hand. Every step they took felt heavier, the weight of their journey pressing down on them. "We need to keep moving," Eliza said, her voice steady but firm. "The Zarnok know where we're headed. If we stop, they'll catch up." Marcus glanced at her, his rugged face lined with fatigue. "How much farther?" Sarah looked up from the map, her brow furrowed. "Another 15 kilometers, maybe more, but this terrain is going to slow us down." Eliza nodded, her mind racing. They had to balance speed with caution. The volcanic wasteland was a natural death trap, littered with fissures that could erupt without warning and geysers spewing toxic steam. On top of that, the Zarnok were undoubtedly planning their next move. She couldn't afford any mistakes. As the team pressed on, the air grew thicker with heat and the acrid smell of sulfur. The ground beneath their boots was unstable, shifting with every step. Eliza's instincts were on high alert, her senses tuned to the slightest movement. She knew the Zarnok were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Hours passed, and the team's progress slowed to a crawl. The oppressive heat sapped their strength, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. Eliza led the way, her sharp eyes scanning for danger. She spotted a narrow ridge that stretched across a deep chasm, the only viable path forward. The ridge was barely wide enough for a single person, its surface slick with ash and molten residue. "We'll have to cross here," Eliza said, turning to her team. "One at a time. Stay low and keep your balance. Marcus nodded and stepped forward, his broad shoulders tensing as he approached the ridge. He moved cautiously, his boots finding purchase on the precarious path. Eliza watched him closely, her heart pounding as the ground beneath him shifted slightly. He made it across, his heavy frame landing with a thud on the other side. Sarah went next, her smaller frame moving with surprising agility. She reached the other side and turned to give Eliza a quick nod. Eliza gestured for the remaining team members to follow, her eyes never leaving the ridge. She was the last to cross, her muscles coiled with tension as she balanced on the narrow ledge. The chasm below seemed to stretch endlessly, a black void that threatened to swallow her whole. The sun setting, she focused on her footing, forcing herself to breathe steadily. When she finally reached the other side, she exhaled a shaky breath. Her relief short-lived as a distant roar echoed across the wasteland. "The Zarnok," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're close." Eliza's mind raced. They couldn't afford another direct confrontation, not in their current state. She scanned the terrain, her eyes settling on a cluster of jagged rocks that jutted out like broken teeth. "We'll take cover there," she said, pointing to the formation. "If they're coming, we need to be ready." The team moved quickly, their movements deliberate but strained. Eliza crouched behind one of the larger rocks, her hand gripping the hilt of her blade. She could feel the heat radiating from the volcanic ground beneath her, the air thick with tension. She glanced at Marcus, who was positioned a few meters away, his spear at the ready. Sarah was beside him, her eyes darting between the horizon and the map in her hand. The roar grew louder, and moments later the Zarnok appeared. 3 warriors emerged from the haze, their silver armor gleaming against the orange glow of the volcanic wasteland. At the center was General Varthak himself, his massive frame casting an imposing shadow. His amber eyes locked onto Eliza, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You've made it farther than I expected," Varthak said, his voice a deep rumble. "But this is where your journey ends." Eliza stepped forward, her blade drawn. She felt the weight of her team's eyes on her, their trust implicit in their silence. "If you want to stop us," she said, her voice steady, "you'll have to go through me." Varthak's smile widened, and he gestured for his warriors to attack. The Zarnok charged, their movements swift and brutal. Marcus met one of them head-on, his spear clashing against the warrior's claws. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the air, but Marcus held his ground, his muscles straining with the effort. Sarah engaged another warrior, using her agility to stay one step ahead of his powerful strikes. She led him into the jagged rocks, where his larger frame struggled to maneuver. Eliza faced Varthak directly, her blade glinting in the dim light. He moved with terrifying speed, his claws slashing through the air. She dodged and parried, each strike testing the limits of her endurance. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the sounds of clashing metal and ragged breaths. Eliza fought with everything she had, her movements precise and deliberate. She knew she couldn't match Varthak's strength, but she used his aggression against him, luring him into overextending. When he swung too wide, she delivered a sharp strike to his side, the blade slicing through a weak point in his armor. "You!" Ryan called out. Varthak roared in pain, his amber eyes blazing with fury. He lunged at Eliza, his claws aiming for her throat. She ducked at the last moment, driving her blade into his leg. He stumbled, his movements growing erratic. Eliza seized the opportunity, rallying her team with a shout. "Now!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Finish them!" Marcus delivered a powerful blow to his opponent, his spear driving through the warrior's chest. Sarah outmaneuvered hers, leading him into a narrow crevice where he became trapped. Eliza turned her focus back to Varthak, her blade poised for the final strike. The general met her gaze, his expression a mix of rage and grudging respect. "You fight well," he said, his voice strained. "But this is far from over." Eliza didn't hesitate. She drove her blade into his chest, the force of the strike knocking him to the ground. He fell with a heavy thud, his massive frame motionless against the scorched earth. The battlefield fell silent, the only sound the faint hiss of steam rising from the volcanic ground. Eliza stood over Varthak, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at her team, their faces weary but determined. They had survived another trial, but the journey was not yet over. "We keep moving," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. "The extraction point is close. Let's finish this." The team trudged forward, each step heavier than the last. The volcanic wasteland behind them faded into the distance, and the horizon revealed a final stretch of barren desert. The air shimmered with heat, and the sun bore down relentlessly. Every breath burned in their chests, and every muscle ached from days of grueling trials. But Eliza Harper refused to slow her pace. She knew the extraction point was near, and she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her like never before. Marcus Kane walked beside her, his spear slung over one shoulder. His face was grim, his brow furrowed with concentration. He didn't speak, but the determined set of his jaw spoke volumes. Sarah Connors followed a few steps behind, clutching the map tightly in her hands. Her sharp eyes darted between the terrain ahead and the faded markings on the map, her mind working furiously to ensure they stayed on course. His grimy jaw took notice of her first, but the map and sketches filled in the gaps, her eyes working furiously to ensure they stayed on course. The silence between them was broken only by the sound of their boots crunching against the hard-packed earth. Eliza glanced over her shoulder, scanning the horizon for any sign of the Zarnok. She knew they had inflicted a serious blow to their adversaries in the last battle, but she also knew the Zarnok were relentless. If any of them had survived, they wouldn't give up the hunt so easily. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, Sarah raised her hand to signal the team to stop. "We're close," she said, her voice hoarse from dehydration. "The extraction point should be just over that ridge." Eliza nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She gestured for the team to move forward, her senses on high alert. The ridge ahead was steep, its rocky surface broken by jagged outcroppings. She climbed carefully, her fingers gripping the rough stone for support. Marcus followed close behind, his massive frame moving with surprising agility. Sarah brought up the rear, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When Eliza reached the top of the ridge, she froze. Below them lay the extraction point, a large circular platform embedded in the desert floor, its metallic surface gleaming in the fading sunlight. Around it stood several Talnari arbiters, their translucent forms shimmering like mirages. But what drew Eliza's attention, and sent a chill down her spine, was the sight of a lone Zarnok warrior, standing between them and the platform. The warrior was massive, even by Zarnok standards, his silver armor battered but intact. His amber eyes glowed with an intensity that made Eliza's stomach twist. She recognized him immediately, Commander Ralthor, one of Varthak's most feared lieutenants. His presence here was no accident. Marcus reached the top of the ridge and let out a low curse. "Of course it couldn't be easy," he muttered, his grip tightening on his spear. Eliza glanced at Sarah, who had just reached the ridge. The strategist's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't take him head-on," Sarah said. "Not after everything we've been through." Eliza nodded, her mind racing. She knew Sarah was right. The team was exhausted, their strength nearly spent. But retreat wasn't an option. The extraction point was their only way off this planet, and Ralthor wasn't going to step aside willingly. "We need a distraction," Eliza said, her voice calm but firm. "Marcus, you and Sarah circle around to the left, draw his attention. I'll come at him from the other side." Marcus hesitated, his brow furrowing. "You sure about this?" Eliza met his gaze, her green eyes steady. "We don't have a choice. Trust me." He nodded, his expression grim. "All right, let's do this." As Marcus and Sarah moved into position, Eliza descended the ridge, her movements slow and deliberate. The rocky terrain offered little cover, but she kept low, using the shadows to mask her approach. Ralthor stood motionless in the center of the clearing, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He seemed to be waiting, his eyes scanning the ridge with predatory intent. Marcus made the first move, stepping into the open with a shout. He hurled his spear with all his strength, the weapon cutting through the air like a missile. Ralthor reacted instantly, his armored gauntlets swiping the spear aside with a deafening clang. He roared, the sound echoing across the desert, and charged toward Marcus with terrifying speed. Sarah emerged from the shadows, her blade flashing in the fading light. She darted toward Ralthor, aiming for the exposed joints in his armor. The Zarnok spun to face her, his massive claw swinging in a wide arc. She ducked under the strike, her movements quick and precise, but the force of the blow sent her stumbling. Eliza used the chaos to her advantage, closing the distance between herself and Ralthor. Her blade was ready, her muscles coiled like a spring. She moved with calculated precision, her eyes fixed on the weak point she had spotted in his armor during their earlier battles. As Ralthor turned to face Marcus, Eliza struck. Her blade found its mark, driving deep into the back of his knee. The Zarnok let out a guttural roar, his leg buckling under his massive weight. Eliza didn't hesitate. She withdrew the blade and struck again, this time aiming for his side. Ralthor lashed out blindly, his claw catching Eliza across the shoulder. The force of the blow sent her sprawling, pain shooting through her body like fire. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to her feet, her vision swimming. Marcus and Sarah pressed the attack, their combined efforts keeping Ralthor off balance. The battle was brutal, every movement a test of endurance and willpower. But the humans' teamwork and tenacity proved too much for even the formidable Zarnok commander. With a final desperate strike, Marcus drove his spear into Ralthor's chest, the weapon piercing through the weak point in his armor. The Zarnok staggered, his amber eyes wide with disbelief before collapsing to the ground. Eliza stood over him, her breath ragged and her body trembling. She felt no triumph, only relief. The path to the extraction point was clear, but the cost had been immense. The team made their way to the platform, their movements slow and labored. The Thalnari arbiters watched in silence as Eliza stepped onto the platform, followed by Marcus and Sarah. As the platform began to hum with energy, signaling their imminent departure, Eliza looked back at the battlefield one last time. "We made it," Marcus said, his voice low. "But I don't think I'll ever forget this." Eliza nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Neither will I." As the platform lifted off the ground, carrying them away from Kalos, Eliza felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had survived the trials, but the scars, physical and emotional, would remain. Humanity had proven its strength, but at a cost that could never be measured. The Zarnok would remember this day, as would the rest of the galaxy. The humans had earned their place among the stars, not through brute force, but through resilience, ingenuity, and an unyielding will to survive. And as Eliza looked out at the stars, she knew their journey was far from over. This was only the beginning.